The novel is set in 1944 during the Second World War in country Victoria. Emily, the main character, is 14 and she's sent against her will to stay at the family property with grandmother, all the other relatives, the staff and the outdoor workers on the farm. She's desperate to go home to Melbourne, but there's no escape, and so inevitably she gets drawn into the lives of those around her, in particular her young, beautiful and aloof Aunt Lydia, Claudio, the Italian prisoner of war who's working on the farm as a labourer, and William, her uncle, who returns from the war wounded in body and spirit. We see the world through Emily's eyes, but of course, as adult readers, we're seeing more than she does. We're understanding things about the world of class, race, religion, and most importantly, issues to do with female sexuality, love and desire, some of the important themes in the book. I think there's an enjoyable frisson by seeing the world through her eyes because we see, as I said, we see more than she does, and there's a lovely sort of irony in that. The book's been described as a novel about desire, deceit and self-discovery, and I think that's a really good description. The story came from stories that my mother told me about her girlhood and her visits to her grandparents' farm in the Western District of Victoria during the Second World War. Mum lived in Melbourne, but that side of the family were all on the land. Emily's not based on Mum. I wanted to have the freedom to create a character and not feel constrained by some version of the truth. I think the way characters are created is still a bit mysterious to me. I started with just a couple of character traits for Emily, and they were her embarrassment about everything and her desire to fit in. And of course, she isn't going to fit in. She's going to have to find her own unique path in life, and that, in a way, is her unexpected education. Well, Lydia actually, sprang to life quite naturally, but she does have a couple of characteristics that I remember from the stories that Mum told me about one of her aunts during that period of the war, where women had to go out and do all these jobs, on the land that normally the men would do. But because the men were away, women took over. So I took a couple of traits from that, and that was Lydia shooting the snakes and her rabbiting and doing the skinning and in order to sell the skins and make some money. Other than that, really, she just, is an invention. I really loved writing William, and I didn't find it at all difficult to write him. Really, for all the characters in the novel, the issue of gender just wasn't a difficulty for me in terms of was it more difficult to write male or female characters. Maybe in another novel that won't be the case. But William's gone through traumatic events. He's had a tough war, and so he's angry and bitter in some ways. But I think that the relationship he makes with Emily is perhaps one of my favourite in the whole book, and the way in which they then affect and change each other is really crucial. The Italian prisoner Claudio did also come from Mum's experiences to some extent, in that on her grandparents' farm during the Second World War, there were Italian prisoners of war working there. It's not a very well-known piece of history, but there were over 18,000 Italian prisoners in Australia from 1941 right through to 1947, when the very last of them were repatriated to Italy. And of course, Australia was having a major manpower shortage at the time, and so that's what led to the Italians being able to work unsupervised on farms. It was really fascinating, and of course there were a lot of rules that were set down by the army about this on both sides, and of course a lot of those rules got broken. For example, they were forbidden, the Italian prisoners were forbidden to have sexual or romantic liaisons with Australian women, but I can tell you from my research that that was not something, well, that was not uncommon. The Italian prisoners were not all fascists by any means, and they had a whole diversity of political views, and that's why I decided to make Claudio a communist. I wanted to confront Emily with some of her prejudices, and I thought it would be a good way to do it. Writing a novel, you're in the driver's seat, and I can tell you there's something very pleasurable about that. And also, it gives you, you have to take a lot of responsibility. When you're writing for film, even if you are the sole writer, you're responding to the director, the producer, the financiers, the script editor. They all have a say. So that is a big difference. Having said that, I wrote 2 films with Anna Kokkinos, who also directed those films, Only the Brave and Head On. And both of those films, we did exactly what we wanted. We took no notice of anybody's ideas about how those scripts should be, structured or what they should be about. And they were both incredibly successful films. So there's some sort of weird irony in that. There are obviously lots of other differences between writing novels and writing screenplays, but I think one of the big ones for me was being able to not know in advance where the novel was really going. To write it, I wrote it in order to find out what happened. And when you're writing a script, you often have to do a lot of pre-planning about the plot and the story and where it's going to end up in order to get development money to write it. So it was really lovely to have that more free way of doing it. I think it's made me a much more visual writer, and I don't mean that in terms of lots of description and scene setting, but just more seeing the action in my mind's eye and being able to write from that perspective. I think it's also made me more aware of telling a good story and keeping the reader engaged and wanting to turn the pages. I think it's made me, I think it's really developed my ability to create memorable and vivid characters. And I think the other thing that it's done is it's made me much more open to feedback, because obviously when you're writing scripts, you do have to take into account all these other people's views and positions, and sometimes that can be frustrating, but I can tell you it can also really help to make your work stronger. And I found that to be true, very true in the case of writing this novel, that I loved the feedback that I got. And it certainly made the novel stronger and better.